Welcome to Wellsprings Community Church.
Personally, some of us have known illness and various other setbacks, like a wheel running over our paws. We've picked up a puppy deliberately last weekend, and that's sort of changed our lives, and it's raised all sorts of questions about what's going to happen next. As you can imagine, when is the next accident going to happen? There are all sorts of other important questions that are running around the place at the moment, aren't there? When is a party not a party? When is it acceptable to wear tinsel or not? All sorts of things like that. I want to concentrate this morning on a much more important question. And it's the question that starts off the hymn that we have just listened to. What child is this? Now, I must admit, I'm not too familiar with that hymn. And when I say I'm not too familiar, I think that's the first time I've ever heard it. But that's the question that I want us to consider this morning. What child is this? And in one of the verses that was sung there, it starts off with the line, "So bring him incense, gold and myrrh." And they are, as we are probably all very much aware, they're the gifts that the Magi brought to the child Jesus. Now, I know we're in Advent, so it's before Christmas, and I know they were the gifts of the Magi who probably didn't visit Jesus until he was 2 years old. But let's leave all of those things to one side for the moment. And I'd like to consider that question: what child is this? And perhaps do that slightly differently. And so this is from the perspective of one of those who travelled to Bethlehem. My name, did you say? Oh, you'd be amazed at how many people ask me that. I always give them the same answer. My name isn't important. This story isn't about me or about my companions. It's about someone else. You know what it's like when you've been waiting for something for a long time, and then it suddenly happens. And when I say a long time, I don't mean just weeks or months or even years. I mean decades, centuries. And as I look back now over the years since those events, some aspects are still crystal clear in my mind. We had studied the writings. We knew that centuries ago, Balaam had said that a star will come out of Jacob, a scepter will rise from Israel, a star and a king. Now, we had studied the writings and we had studied the stars and we had waited. Our knowledge extended so far as to knowing that something would happen in the land off to the west. A king would be born who, in some way or other, would change the course of history. And then it happened. One clear night, a new star rose. And it was there the next night too, in the west, towards the land of Israel. And we discussed backwards and forwards as to what it was. A conjunction of the planets Jupiter and Saturn, perhaps, so that made a lot of sense. The planet of kingship with the planet of Saturday, and the Jews were known for their observance of the Sabbath. Or perhaps it was a new wandering star, a comet, we'd say now. It didn't really matter. It was there, and it was bright, and it meant something. It meant that a new king had been born in Israel, a king to the Jews. Well, there was some debate about what to do. We didn't just leap on our camels and head off. But we all basically recognised that we had to do something. And in the end, we decided there really was only one thing that we could do. Some of us would have to go to Israel. We'd have to go to the city of David, to Jerusalem, to see this new king and to worship him. We started to prepare. I hate packing, especially when you're going to a country you've never visited before and you've no idea what the weather is going to be like. But still, we got everything together. Most important of all, we spent quite some time discussing what gifts we were going to take. We talked about whether we should take gifts that had some kind of symbolism. But then we realised that what we thought something symbolised might not be what a Jew would think. So it was safer to simply take some costly, some luxury gifts. Gifts that would be worthy of a king. And if you think about it, a gift for a king has to be costly. It needs to be a luxury. You're not going to take a bag of flour or a pot of oil, are you? In the end, we decided on gold. Because, well, it's gold. Everyone knows gold is a luxury. Surprisingly heavy to carry, though. Still, the perfect choice. We then chose frankincense, because frankincense is only found in our country and in India and Somalia. It comes from particularly scraggy trees. They're not much to look at. But once you tap the tree and you collect the hardened resin and put it on a hot rock near a fire, the smell, the aroma, it's amazing. That was a rare luxury item that truly was fit for a king. And it was easy to pack and easy to carry. Finally, the third gift, myrrh. Like frankincense, this is a resin. It's tapped from not scraggy trees this time, but from thorny, sharp trees. And it's only found in our country or Ethiopia. Like frankincense, you could burn it or you could add it to wine to make a painkiller. Or you can use it in burial ceremonies. Yeah, that would do. Precious and rare. So there we had them. Gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Together they made a gift fit for any king. Gifts that befit the dignity of the role that this new child had been born to. So finally, we were ready, and it had taken us quite a while. These things can't be rushed, you know. But having decided that a star was important, having chosen our gifts, we then had to decide which of us would make the journey. And I mean, not everyone fancied the trip. Some were too old for the difficulties we would face, and some were, well, let's face it, just much too young and immature for the importance of such a mission. In the end, we decided. I don't remember exactly how many of us we were, but there were a number of us. Enough of us to cause a bit of a stir when we arrived in Jerusalem, but that's getting a little ahead of ourselves. We were ready, gifts all loaded, And so we set off. The star was still there, and it remained there, always ahead of us, and visible even in daylight, all the way to Jerusalem. The journey must have taken us 5 or 6 weeks, but finally we arrived at the gates of the city. Well, none of us had been there before, so we had no idea where we should go. It wasn't exactly a big city, but it was crowded. And so we watered the animals at one of the wells outside the walls, and once we'd done that, we asked some of the people around for directions. It was a simple question, or at least we thought it was a simple question. Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? Now, you'd have thought that was fairly easy to answer. If a new prince had been born, it would probably have been known by the people in the city. We'd expected also that there would be some sense of excitement, of joy perhaps there in Jerusalem. Okay, it had been quite a while since the birth, but our questions did not bring smiles and nods and happiness, and I don't think that was because of our accents. It brought consternation and concern. Everyone we spoke to seemed disturbed, not happy. Eventually, an envoy from King Herod came to see us. Now, we knew something of Herod. His reputation had got even as far as where we lived. He wasn't known as a benevolent ruler. He was ruthless, tyrannical, and cruel. The only good thing we'd ever heard about him was that he had restarted the building of the temple. And so he summoned us to his palace, but not during the day, and not through the main gate. 1 or 2 of our number were a little bit offended by that. Doesn't he know we're magi? One asked. Going in through the tradesman's entrance. Unbelievable. Still, we went. After all, we'd come a long way to worship this new future king. And Herod was all politeness and courtesy once we met him. Looking back, perhaps a little bit too courteous, a little too polite, a bit too keen to know all the details. Well, he knew why we were there, but then we had asked a lot of people. And he was able to bring us a piece of news. He said that he had spoken to the priests and the scribes there in Jerusalem, and they had pinpointed Bethlehem as the birthplace of this king. Idiot, I heard one of my colleagues whisper behind me. Of course, Bethlehem. Not the city of rule, but the city of birth. The birthplace of David would be the birthplace of this king. Now, why didn't I think of that? It's all there. It's in Micah. What made me forget Micah? I turned and I looked at him, and he smiled a little sheepishly and stopped muttering. And then Herod asked us more questions about the star. And I mean, you could see it through the window of his palace, shining out to the southwest. He wanted to know when it had first appeared. Well, we told him. We couldn't see any reason not to. If only we had known then what we heard later. You have no idea how that feels. But at the time, he was all polite, all positive. He asked us to continue our journey and find this new king, and even said that once we had found the child, we should report back to him so he could also worship him. He then had us escorted back out of his palace and, yes, through the tradesman's entrance again. So the next morning we set out for Bethlehem, the final leg of our long journey. Back when we'd started, we thought we knew what was at the end. There would be a palace and there would be a child who would be king. There would be joy, there'd be fanfare and celebration. And now? Well, now we had no idea what to expect. Jerusalem was at least a capital city of sorts, but Bethlehem, what was Bethlehem? One of our group asked some of the locals about the village while we were eating breakfast. It was only 6 miles away, a short journey of a couple of hours. A small village of 200 people, that's all. Well, we thought, at least it's not going to be difficult to find the child there. And the star led us on, and it was strangely comforting to see it. No, more than that, it brought us joy, real joy. Not because it had been our companion for the whole journey, but because we realised it was the signpost to someone very special. And so, mid-morning, we arrived in Bethlehem. The star seemed to stop above one specific house. Wasn't much to look at. Single-storey mud house. And we suddenly all felt a little nervous. Ridiculous, I know, but what were we going to find? The door was opened by a young woman. Behind her, we saw a carpenter's workshop. You know, even today, all these years later, I can't smell sawdust or see a newly finished piece of furniture without my mind going back to that moment. And it was as the door was opened that we realised we really didn't know what we were going to say, how we were going to start this conversation. And what do you say? So the simple question seemed the best. Is this where we will find the one who is born King of the Jews? The woman smiled, opened the door and invited us in. Her husband came over from his work and welcomed us. Every tiny little detail of that house, of the interior, of the people is etched on my mind even now with a clarity that is so sharp it almost hurts. And then we saw the boy. Over the years, I've tried to put into words what I felt at that moment, and you know, I really can't do it justice. There in front of us, we just knew was the culmination of history. He was at the centre, not just of the story of one nation, but the centre of the story of the whole of creation. We had travelled a great distance, but we could sense that in a very real way, he had travelled further. Not geographically, perhaps, but travelled further nonetheless. We prided ourselves on our knowledge, on our learning, on our history and our centuries, long traditions. But in those very young eyes, you could sense a wisdom, a history, a knowledge which made ours fade into insignificance. And all of us, without any word or sign, simply dropped to our knees in worship. And we brought out our gifts, laying them on the floor of the house. There was something incongruous about the gold and the frankincense and the myrrh amidst the sawdust of this humble, ordinary carpenter's house, and yet something fitting as well, as though the ordinary surroundings veiled something greater, something glorious. Just as a young child standing in front of us seemed so ordinary and yet so extraordinary, as though in him something of the heavens had touched the earth. We spent the day in Bethlehem with the child and his family, and camped that night on the outskirts of this small, seemingly inconsequential village in the hills, knowing that the world was never going to be the same again. But it wasn't an easy sleep. It was fitful, restless. One of our number woke with a start just as dawn was breaking. He'd had a dream, or perhaps not a dream, because it was a dream like no other. It was clear, more like a real encounter than a dream. He told us that he'd been told that we should not return to Jerusalem. We should not return to Herod, that danger lay in that route. It had been a strange journey, and this was just one more strange event on that journey, but we packed up and we started our long return journey, making sure we avoided Jerusalem. It was only after we'd travelled for a few miles that we noticed the star was no longer there. It had done its job. It had led us to the new king. And as we travelled, we shared our thoughts and our emotions. We talked about the future, a future that would be forever changed, because in a small house, in a small village, we'd met the king. The king whose name is important. The king called Jesus.